Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to be in very good company. As many of you know, over the past year, the Alliance for Securing Democracy convened a task force of 30 leading national security and foreign policy experts. And it was a group that included representatives from both sides of the aisle and from multiple subdisciplines. Our goal was to devise a national strategy for the United States to secure the advantage in what we see as a persistent, asymmetric, multidimensional competition with authoritarian challengers, one that is playing out across 4 interlocking non-military domains. Those domains include politics, economics, the information environment, and the tech domain. Our task force was chaired by Avril Haines and Eric Edelman, who we're just delighted has joined us today, along with 2 of our task force members, Samantha Power and Kori Schake. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Edelman to highlight some of the key themes and findings of the report before we have a conversation with Ambassador Power and Dr. Schake. And I promise I will endeavor to get all of you very quickly into that discussion. So when the time comes, or as early as the urge strikes you, please submit questions through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we'd be grateful if you could include your name and affiliation when you do that. For now, let me turn it over to Ambassador Edelman, who I think needs little introduction to this group, but among many roles, he's served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and Ambassador to Finland and to Turkey, which means that he's quite steeped in the topics that we'll be discussing today. So without further delay, Eric.
Jessica, thank you very much. And I really want to thank the Alliance for Securing Democracy for sponsoring this terrific task force, and in absentia, my co-chair, Avril Haines, who of course has been designated as incoming Director of National Intelligence by President-elect Biden, which I think is a terrific choice. And I'm delighted that 2 of our task force panelists are joining us today, one Democrat, one Republican, in the spirit of bipartisanship that animated this group. I think that the topic of the study really flows out of the fact that the roughly 25-year post-Cold War era that came upon us after the collapse of the Soviet Union has really come to an end, and the international system is now facing some new challenges. The so-called post-Cold War era, after the collapse of the bipolar central strategic antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union, was marked by ethnic conflicts, by activities of non-state actors, by the consequences of a number of fragile and failed states, giving rise to all sorts of negative phenomena. And those issues, sadly, remain with us as we enter into a new period. But over the past half decade or so, I think there's been a dawning realization that we're entering in a new period of great power competition with a rising China, and a declining but still rather dangerous authoritarian Russia. And much of that conflict has taken place in the so-called gray zone of conflict, which is to say, in areas below the threshold that the United States might want to respond to some act of aggression with military force. We've seen some of this in a geographic sense in the South China Sea, in eastern Ukraine and elsewhere. But in some functional areas, we're not just in competition with our great power rivals. We are actually in daily conflict, and that's in the area of cyber and information and other operations. These regimes, particularly Russia and China, are trying to reshape the liberal rules-based international order largely put in place by the United States and its allies after the Second World War and preserved in the aftermath of the Cold War, in particular by taking advantage of new technologies and the open societies in which we operate to spread disinformation and to seek both political, economic, technological, and information advantages over the United States. Now, some of this, of course, was very apparent in the Russia election interference of 2016 and 2018, and it's ongoing. But I think there's been an increasing recognition that China too is pursuing political influence and using some of these tools against us, including pursuing technological dominance in the future technologies that will shape our societies and the economic and military competitions that we will find ourselves in. So our task force took upon itself identifying ways for the U.S. to address some of the vulnerabilities being exploited by our adversaries, to seek and identify those long-term strategic advantages that our open, innovative society in the United States and more broadly in the West still have, to use against our adversaries in these competitions, and to reframe the competition in a way that is more supportive of liberal, open societies, and that will enable the United States to hopefully succeed in these two long-term competitions. And as I said, I'm delighted that Samantha and Kori have joined us today to talk in more depth about this. And I look forward to hearing and watching the discussion and serving as a resource if anyone wants to call on me for anything.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Eric, and for everything that you did to support and lead this task force. We're all very grateful. I'm going to invite our speakers into the discussion. Ambassador Power, as you all know, was U.S. permanent representative to the United Nations, where she was frequently the public face of President Obama's pushback against Russian aggression in Syria and Ukraine. She's currently teaching at Harvard's Kennedy and law schools. Dr. Schake is currently the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And she's had, of course, a distinguished career in government, including stints at State, Defense, the NSC. Her most recent book asks the question, can the liberal world order be preserved? So I think we have no better experts to have with us for this discussion this morning. Dr. Schake, I thought I might start with you, and note that democracies are facing this persistent asymmetric threat from authoritarian challengers. And one of the major findings of the report was that democracies have distinct advantages of their own that can and should be leveraged for success. So I'm curious for your take on what asymmetric tools democracies should be using to weaken authoritarian regimes and to prevent the spread of illiberalism, and what principles or limitations should guide what democracies do offensively.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I think the fundamental conclusion of the report is that those of us in free societies shouldn't lose confidence that we have the ability to manage these challenges. It's actually a measure of our success that our adversaries need to move to the margins of the conflict spectrum to try and threaten our societies. And that should tell us how strong we are in the center of the national security space, and that we can use the tools of free societies. What we think of as a sort of triple helix of the strengths of free societies: good governance, and entrepreneurial capitalism, and vibrant civil societies. One of the things that was so valuable for me in being a part of this task force was seeing how strong the consensus was among those of us who participated, that we need to be different and better than our adversaries, that we need to rely on what makes our own society successful: the rule of law, civic activism, transparency, and holding our governments accountable. And that by working to strengthen civil society through education, digital literacy, universal national service opportunities, that's how we make our societies even more resilient. And that by doing well what we know how to do, we can protect our societies and push those who would try and corrupt them out of our civic space.
Great, thank you. As we're preparing for a new administration to come to Washington, Ambassador Power, you've written a piece in Foreign Affairs that highlights steps that the administration could take to restore confidence in U.S. leadership. And like the task force, you call for an approach that would leverage our strengths and take advantage of some of the opportunities that China's overreach has created. So I'm curious, what do you think that strategy should look like? And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on a global anti-corruption agenda, which was a finding of both projects.
Thank you so much, and thanks to you in particular for all the work you did drafting the report, and to Eric and Avril and Laura Rosenberger and others for their leadership. It's great to be among you. This is the defining question of our time in many ways, and really looking forward to the discussion and hearing the ideas from people also in the audience, because it looks like an amazing group. So I wrote this foreign affairs piece that, unsurprisingly, given my membership on the task force, does echo some of the recommendations. And my sort of jumping off point was, in fact, to Kori's argument just now, that we have a real opening, which is not how we tend to feel these days. Right? There tends to be a bit of a crisis of confidence on the Democratic side of the global aisle, and authoritarians kind of strutting around feeling like they've had momentum. Biden's victory, of course, places the first major dent in that strut. Dent and strut don't really go together, but the opening comes from more than just that. It is, I think, that we've seen China's overreach in a range of ways. I mean, you would expect, with the massive loans that are being distributed, both, of course, since the pandemic, but also over the really sort of increasing in quantity, over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. But with the Belt and Road Initiative, the Digital Silk Road Initiative, we're focusing on those initiatives in our context to look at all of China's leverage and the tools that it is providing people to oppress. But you would think that all those investments would buy you some soft power here or there, that it would buy you, particularly in the age of Trump and the mishandling of the pandemic here in the United States, some significantly increased favorability ratings, and quite the contrary. And some of that is just the soft power advantage that you write about in the report that we have, and that so far China lacks in terms of other sources of favorability, but some of it is the overreach that you alluded to, and being hyper aggressive and very, very transactional. So both charging very steep interest payments on loans, which doesn't go over well, bringing Chinese workers in, that all predated the pandemic. But then in the last 2 years, asking for a return on those investments, including at places like the UN. So all of that is a big wind up to your question about sort of corruption and where we go from here. I mean, I do think that our U.S. favorability, of course, has tanked in significant ways. China's just hasn't really spiked in any way and has gone down over the last year because of perceived mishandling of the pandemic in the early stages, especially, and because of these other factors. But ours, of course, because of a variety of Trump policies, have gone down. So I think the emphasis generally should be on shows of competence. And as it happens, and your report speaks to U.S. vulnerabilities and the need to shore up U.S. laws on political transparency and financial transparency, and I'll just say a quick word about that in a second. But we have these technical tools like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Bribery Convention, Anti-Bribery Convention. We have been a leader among OECD countries in terms of enforcement. Enforcement has gone down significantly under Trump, but compared to China, which, who has high profile state officials and corporate figures embroiled in corruption scandals around the world, there's almost no enforcement of any kind, notwithstanding President Xi's billing himself as an anti-corruption crusader. So there's a comparative advantage there. There's a set of tools that have been competently used over the years. And this is a great week to have this discussion. The US Congress, has just passed on a bipartisan basis, finally, a beneficial ownership bill, closing this loophole that was allowing anonymous shell companies to set up shop here, taking advantage, just the kind of thing you talk about in the report, of our open system, and now requiring the actual owners, the beneficial owners, those who are benefiting from those shell companies, to disclose who they are before a company can be set up. So that's major. It's the most important anti-money laundering, anti-corruption law passed in this country, I think, in more than 20 years. And the bipartisan dimension of it, given how little gets done on a bipartisan basis, I think should be cause for enthusiasm. We can also start enforcing much more the Magnitsky prong, the corruption prong of the Magnitsky Act. I think getting our own house in order, as your report says, in terms of Citizens United, which is going to be massively challenging to overturn, but reforms in political financing of campaigns, which foreign actors, as you write in the report, are taking advantage of, as well as, of course, big spenders in our own politics. So this corruption is a great example also of a genre, which is the kind of domestic reforms that then have a foreign policy analog. Half the protests that occurred in 2019 around the world, record-setting year for political protests around the world, half of them were linked to citizen concerns about corruption in their own midst. So in terms of meeting people where they are and winning hearts and minds on the street, and in terms of influencing also foreign governments, and especially illiberal governments, where this is a real Achilles heel, because so many illiberal governments and autocratic governments have significant corruption and kleptocracy as part of their governing model. This is a real strategic advantage in this contest.
Great, thank you so much. So we have our first question from the audience, which I'm going to pose in a second, but for those of you who are following along at home, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send us your questions, and if you can, let us know who you are and where you're from. So this first question comes from Megan Richards at GMF. And she notes that President-elect Biden has proposed this global summit for democracies, which will take place, he has promised, in his administration's first year. The question is, how would such a summit help strengthen democracies, and what should be the outcomes of such a summit?
So I can think of a couple of concrete things that democratic societies could do together to strengthen ourselves. One would be a white CFIUS process. You know, the United States has a process of evaluating what foreign companies can invest in the United States, and moving to do that on a multilateral basis among the free societies, where instead of determining who can't invest, we validate each other's ability to invest in our technology sectors, and it begins to create the trust of economic partners. A second thing, secure supply chains. Japan and Australia have already launched an initiative in this regard, and I think all free societies putting shoulder to the wheel and identifying ways that we can cooperate to ensure that our economies, our healthcare networks can receive what they need in duress or even routinely. I think there are lots of small practical things like that that can expand the circle of trust, and as Ambassador Power said, can give us the tools to work cooperatively and multilaterally to strengthen our societies.
May I add just a couple things also, Jessica? I agree with everything that Kori has said, unsurprisingly, but I do think that, you know, one of the key elements of your report, I note the distinction you make between technology and information. But both of those spheres, the fight against disinformation, not even misinformation, I feel like we should stop using that word, but willful disinformation, you know, sitting down with actors that have been more effective than we have in fending off those efforts. Having, you know, the DHS agency that actually did fare very, very well in terms of election infrastructure on the tech side, protecting our infrastructure this time around, having them sit down with the analogs around the world. That kind of thing has not been happening for the last 4 years, notwithstanding what happened in the 2016 election. So I think, again, in the report, you write so much about authoritarians learning from one another. We need to get back in the business of democracies learning from one another. And that requires convening. I think it is noteworthy that the president-elect, just to our earlier exchange about corruption, has said that he's going to issue a presidential directive on day one, saying that the fight against corruption is a core, I shouldn't say on day one, but is going to issue a presidential direction, presumably early in his administration, declaring corruption, fighting corruption, a core national security interest. This set of questions, in addition to the supply chain issue and others that Kori raised, but of other ways in which we can pool our knowledge, but also coordinate. For example, corruption sanctions. You know, the European Union has just passed its own version of the Magnitsky Law. And now we have the chance to do what hasn't been done for the last 4 years, which is get more out of the sanctions that we've been doing bilaterally by multilateralizing them. They'll inevitably have much more bite in that regard.
Jessica, could I just add one thing to what Samantha just said, which is that to be very specific about sort of comparing best practices on the information side. One of the things that I find attractive about a summit of democracies is it would almost force all of us to recognize what some are trying to deny, which is that there is a very strong ideological dimension to this great power competition. And to give one specific example, Finland has been exemplary in dealing with Russian disinformation. And of course, they're right, sitting on the border. And there's a lot to be learned from their experience. And having this kind of a venue, as Samantha says, is the perfect way to be able to share those kinds of lessons.
And Taiwan vis-a-vis China as well, just incredible.
Yes, absolutely.
Standard setter in that regard.
Yep, we have a colleague producing a paper on that, so stay tuned. We have a question from Austin Doler from the Penn Biden Center, who asks whether the West needs to offer the developing world alternatives to Chinese investment schemes like the Belt and Road Initiative, and if so, what this could look like. And I would note that this echoes a couple of questions that we got in the queue, including from Rick Fitzpatrick, so thanks.
So I'll take a shot at that one. It is certainly true that providing better alternatives is essential. China's now the world's largest creditor, and they are going to have important choices to make about either debt forgiveness or enforcement, as so many of the Belt and Road Initiative projects, which weren't funded by the IMF, the World Bank, or Western countries because they didn't think that they had the prospect for ever becoming economically viable. That law of gravity is about to hit Chinese loans, and they are going to have choices to make, and we are going to have choices to make about how we handle it. Just to use one example, the government of Zambia can't repay its current loans. And one of the ways in which China is chipping away at the liberal international order is to demand that they be the priority for repayment, that Chinese state-owned companies get to be first in line. That's not the practice that the international organizations have held. And so in all sorts of ways, large and small, we need to be willing to defend the rules of order, but also, as the questioner raises, we need to provide more constructive alternatives. And one great example is being put forward by India and Japan, which is to create an investment fund as a competitor to the Belt and Road Initiative, but that requires transparency of contracts and requires accountability on issues like the construction standards and also climate effects of projects. That's a terrific way to force the Chinese in particular into accountability for what they are doing in the developing world, and to show that we in free societies not only can compete, but have better models.
May I add just a couple words again? So I think that thinking through, again, in the spirit of linking anti-corruption efforts to the broader idea of accountable governance is really important, and it links to this question. But thinking through how are American civil society organizations, foundations, and yes, the US government supporting those actors in countries that have been the beneficiaries of Belt and Road investments in order to ensure that those loans are properly understood on, if it's on the front end, there's still plenty of loans still and plenty of infrastructure investments still being made every day. You know, for example, take the coal-fired power plant and the other environmental effects of some of these investments. Just thinking about the sort of, it's almost a process point, but about democratization, civil society accountability for the projects that China is doing. Then to pivot to the actual question, which was not about that, but I think the US has a role in, and the Trump administration tried to do this and drawing attention to, you know, some of the flaws in that approach, but there wasn't much of an alternative really being offered. When I look back to the Obama years, which feels like a galaxy far, far away, but you know, I do think initiatives like the US-Africa Business Summit, or I think it was the US called the US-Africa Summit, but fundamentally brought CEOs together with African leaders. That was something we only did a few times over the life of those 8 years. China's been doing things like that, you know, every year, if not multiple times a year, you know, for a very long time, and has been making those investments. What I found in my dealings with African civil society and African leaders alike was a desire for private sector partnership, private sector investment, American companies being the gold standard and very well branded in terms of soft power in much of the continent. And of course, in keeping with the global South and the countries within it wanting to be seen as partners and not as recipients of aid from anybody. They want to move in that direction. And then the last thing I'd say is I think an intriguing new entity is this Development Financing Corporation under USAID, which is just, I think has not yet reached anywhere near its potential. But I think thinking through how that can be a tool, both just in its own right, because not everything has to be weaponized in this, you know, standoff with China, but, you know, a pretty innovative addition potentially to the toolbox. But again, I think underemployed and with great potential going forward.
Thanks. This question comes from Daniel Stid at the Hewlett Foundation, who asks whether, what is the potential for the strategic rivalry with China to foster more social solidarity and reduce polarization here at home, and thereby put us in a better position to defend democracy abroad? Can this occur in a constructive way? And I would note that multiple questions in the queue ask or get at domestic vulnerabilities, from conflicts around race and policing to trust in institutions broadly. So welcome your thoughts on those, how those domestic issues connect up to this broader frame.
It was, for me, the center of gravity of all of our conversations in the task force, that the best way for the United States to compete with China is to be the best version of ourselves. That good governance, transparency, rule of law, strengthening democracy domestically is our most important tool in managing the competition with China. That came through in every single aspect of our conversations in the task force, and I think comes through really clearly in the report that you know, the performance of democracy in America in the last 4 years, and even now, as the president calls for overturning an election that he lost by 7 million votes and a ton of electoral college votes, you know, it's hard for the United States to throw our shoulders back and defend democracy and free societies elsewhere when we are such a poor example. And so strengthening democracy at home in all of the ways that the report talks about really is essential if we want to, as Eric Edelman pointed out, play to the strengths of this ideological competition, which is about the vibrancy of free societies and the ability of free societies to solve our own problems and to help others solve theirs.
And I just note that this is, you know, if anybody asks me, what's the greatest national security threat facing the United States, the Biden administration, answer: polarization. I mean, domestic polarization. whether you're looking at it through the prism of the expenditures that might need to be made in the defense area or in terms of countering China, polarization, we have got to again, make a dent, close the gaps, and soften it somehow. And the we is a royal we, right? It's not about a government role as such. And I think but then that opens up the conversation, right? It's really, really hard, right? This is the nut that it is very, very hard to crack. So, but just to concretize like little things that could be done that would make a difference, right? Unfortunately, the Supreme Court punted, I think, in a really problematic way on the gerrymandering question. Gerrymandering, as it is currently done, exacerbates polarization. The Supreme Court makes it possible for states to deal with that issue. And of course, citizens can continue to voice to their state legislators, that it bothers them that now their elected representatives are choosing their voters rather than the other way around, right? That's not how it was supposed to work, last I checked. So that's an example of, again, it's very high hanging fruit in the sense that we haven't been able to do it, but little inroads have been made at the state level in ways that maybe can offer proof of concept. I think polling, this is another sort of faint source of hope, as Kori indicated, of course, with what's going on in the with Trump's election claims, the polls these days, luckily we can't believe polls anymore, but to the degree that we believe polls, they're very disturbing in terms of the share of Republicans who believe somehow that the election was stolen and that Trump's messages really are getting through. And so that's in keeping with, really worrying polls that are reflections of, not just different ideological view, in fact, not in some cases, different ideological views or different views about even sort of what the values are and the interests that we should be pursuing, but different factual realities. And I will say that the tech companies whose algorithms push people into more extreme places for reasons of profit, for sure, unequivocally, that's why they do it. More time, more extreme means more time, more eyeballs, and they have not changed enough. They have not adjusted to the damage that is doing. And the fact that polarization is the biggest threat to our democracy at home and our capacity for leadership abroad. But they have shown in other areas, they've made modest adjustments in this space, but they have shown in other areas an ability to change. So they are, taking misinformation, disinformation on COVID. They're much more aggressive as it relates to health misinformation. They're not doing that on climate change, which to me is unforgivable, given the health implications. If you want to stick within the health domain, that should be covered as well. But they've taken Holocaust denial now off their site and QAnon accounts and so forth. And I mention that not because those are necessarily responsive. I suppose they have some relationship to polarization. They at least have a relationship to conspiracy theories that are embedded by polarization. But it's more that it proves that they can learn and that they can grow. Because a year ago, they were giving you all the reasons where they couldn't take Holocaust denial, and I'm talking specifically in this instance about Facebook. But there's a lot more that the big social media empires, I mean, Facebook is worth more than, in terms of the equivalent of GDP, than 170 countries within the 193 nation United Nations, right? 170 without any of the checks and balances that so many countries have, especially democratic countries, but even the more illiberal countries have some checks and balances. And so that check is really going to have to come in the short term from citizens and consumers. And the last thing I'd say is the polling is very disturbing. But what's really curious about the polling is even though it shows that Democrats will no longer marry people of the opposing political party and Republicans, the numbers are slightly lower in terms of the vehemence of that on the Republican side, but I think that's just an artifact of who's in power, who's the president at a given time. But so those polling numbers are terrible. But if you actually look at people's aspirations, people hate polarization. So we're all part of it. We're all doing it in our own ways. But if you actually look at the polling, there's got to be some hope in the fact that one of the main objectives that people have for our country going forward is to see less of it and to see more across the aisle cooperation.
Jessica, as a 38-year survivor of a mixed religious and political marriage, to Samantha's point. Let me try and offer a little ray of hope. I mean, it's certainly very easy to become very depressed over what we've seen over the last 4 years, and in particular the last 4 weeks with regard to polarization. But to the questioner's point, I do think there is a potential that the strategic competition with China can bring forth perhaps some measure of bipartisanship. Samantha was talking earlier about bipartisanship and the anti-corruption effort. I mean, it is notable that our adversaries, our authoritarian adversaries, weaponize corruption and use it against us and against our allies. And people are recognizing that, and the fact that they could come together in a bipartisan way is a good thing. You know, we focus a lot on, in the report, on the economic and the technological competition. And I'm moderately hopeful that after 4 years, we might finally see Infrastructure Week, and that there is a potential for Republicans and Democrats to come together, understanding that in some areas, infrastructure is crucial. I mean, to the Trump administration's credit, it is, you know, raised up the Huawei and 5G issue. That is a really, really important issue. And I think there may be more willingness to try and come together, you know, on a patriotic basis across party lines to address something that no matter who is running the executive branch, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, are going to have to deal with, and are going to need the wherewithal with which to deal with it.
I really hope. Ambassador Power, your comments about the role of social media platforms, I think, is a good segue into a question we got from Amanda Long, who asks, how can we harness the benefits of technology while protecting our own democracy and national security?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are ways in which one of the things that we launched in the Obama years was something called the Open Government Partnership. We launched it with critical partners like Norway and India and the United Kingdom and Chile. And I mean, what was amazing, and the conceit for the partnership is that you bring governments, the private sector, and civil society together. And the private sector was, at least as we conceived of it initially, kind of shorthand for also thinking through how tech companies might be at the table providing civil society with the tools the tools they need. They don't need technology necessarily, but technology can be a force multiplier in terms of holding their governments accountable. And it actually, the OGP drew the distinction you draw between technology and information, because even in low tech circumstances, information, as we've talked about, and a requirement of transparency ends up being the most empowering thing you can give civil society. But I think that initiative, which lives on and has its own secretariat, again, the Trump administration, hasn't been championing it, to say the least, in terms of the transparency dimensions of it. But it offers, I think, a model for how these three legs of the stool can kind of come together. And I think also, if you look at Taiwan, which is, sort of become one of my favorite places to talk about, just because of how much innovation has happened in that space. We already alluded to it in the disinformation space, but on COVID, the tech companies at the table, on the recent elections, at the table, helping, civil society crowdsource fact checking around stuff that, let's say, Chinese actors were putting in the mix. That was around the election. Same kinds of things happening around disinformation in the COVID space, but you also see them, and this is very much what the Open Government Partnership tried to encourage, people who go and buy masks, or pharmacy owners typing into a database what their mask supply is, or just every time a mask is sold, that getting reflected on an app where citizens then know, oh, I can't go to that pharmacy if I'm out of masks, I've got to go to this pharmacy. And really seeing, your report, and we often talk a lot about just delivery, about democracy delivering. I mean, technology can be such an important tool as an information aggregator, as a way for citizens to actually, if they know, maybe they get a text message that says, how many resources, this is in very developing parts of the world or developing countries, what did the central government send to the panchayat for school? And they get insight into what that figure was. And then they realize that, wait, they didn't see any of the textbooks. They didn't see any of the desks. They didn't see, and then they're empowered with that information that they might have been buried in some filing cabinet. They're empowered then to protest or to vote people out or to take advantage again of those accountability tools that they have. But without the information, they wouldn't be able to do that. And technology is a vehicle for information to get to many more places than otherwise would have happened.
Thanks. Dr. Schake, you mentioned ideology and its role in the competition with China, and I'm curious if you could unpack that a little bit for us. Brad Potter from Hopkins SAIS, sort of notes that the Cold War was a contest of ideologies, and I think is, asking whether there is a coherent ideology on the other side of this conflict, and whether we're sort of countering it in a coherent way.
Oh, I think that's a great question. So the most important theorist of the liberal international order, John Eikenberry, has a new book just out called A World Safe for Democracy. And in it, he makes a really interesting argument about why liberal societies are so successful and so prosperous. And I haven't seen the argument made before, and it seems to me both fundamentally true and important in this, which is that what free societies are good at is managing modernity. We're good at adapting to changes. We're innovators. We're, we often feel like we're at the forefront of cultural and technological change in ways that are wearying, right? I mean, we see it with the exhaustion that people are feeling being bombarded with partisan information on social media. But we don't often give enough credit to the fact that what free societies are actually good at is solving problems. Maybe not in the immediate, but in a 5 and a 10-year timeline. And the nature of the challenge that a rising China and a resentful Russia in particular pose is stipulating that their alternatives wouldn't produce the 2008 financial crisis. It wouldn't produce the mistakes that the United States and others made during the war on terrorism. And it's certainly true, but it's also true that those societies are less innovative. They are less resilient in the face of change, and they're less able to provide fresh answers to fresh problems. And so a part of the ideological challenge is that what China is posing is an international order where might makes right. And that has never been the nature of the international order that the United States and its allies created after World War II. We created an international order of rules, of cooperation through multinational institutions, and of mutual security, where small and medium-sized states had rights, and strong states also had obligations. And that's an international order where participation has largely been voluntary because it's attractive. And that's the fundamental contradiction between an international order that China is posing, where people don't have rights, states have sovereignty, and where you can force acceptance as opposed to cajole voluntary acceptance. So I think Eric Edelman was right at the start of this conversation, that there is a deeply ideological nature to the competition we are seeing because China's posing a different kind of international order. And we shouldn't lose confidence that even if China has 1 billion people and a government that can impose its will on them, that free societies banding together have larger numbers, greater social resilience, because we have the voluntary cooperation of our societies.
Since I'm the one who introduced this ideological dimension into the discussion, let me just add a couple of points to what Kori's just said in answer to Brad's question. You know, the ideological challenge in the Cold War was pretty clear. You had, on the one hand, you know, totalitarian command economies versus, you know, open, free capitalist societies, and the lineaments of the ideological division were very, you know, very clear. Because it's a little bit less clear in the current environment, as I said earlier, there's some people who are inclined to, you know, to downplay this ideological dimension. But I think it's extremely important, and it ties back to a lot of what Kori and Samantha were talking about with regard to our own domestic polarization and weaknesses. The authoritarian governments and adversaries we're dealing with are incredibly threatened just by the existence of our founding principles, because they violate them every day. And so for them, the ideological challenge is to basically argue, you're no better than we are. Actually, all of these governments are the same. There's no real difference between Putin's Russia and Donald Trump's America. There's no real difference between, you know, Xi Jinping's, you know, China and, you know, governments elsewhere in the world. All of this is just hypocrisy on the part of the democratic world and the free world. It's one of the reasons why they export their own criminality and corruption to us, because they want to be able to say, see, you're just the same, you're no better. And it's why what's happened in the last 4 weeks is so damaging, because the president saying that, you know, our election is rigged, our election is corrupt, when we know that the elections in Russia, for instance, are rigged and corrupt, is extremely very, you know, damaging to the ability of the United States to stand up for the things we've traditionally stood up for: human rights, rule of law, and, you know, democratic processes and procedures. And let me add one final point to this, and I've said this in, you know, multiple fora, and I will continue to say it. We live in an era where the fundamental threat to democracy, unlike the Cold War, when it was almost entirely from the totalitarian left, now arises from the authoritarian right. That's different from the historical experience all three of us on this panel grew up with. In the Cold War, liberal Democrats and left of center parties played an incredibly important role by articulating what the, you know, legitimate bounds of politics were, and ruling outside those bounds the Soviet Communist Party and all parties associated with it around the world, because they didn't believe in the fundamental principles of free elections, free choice, and openness of societies. Today, when the challenge comes from the right, I think it's incumbent upon those of us who see ourselves on the right of center side of the spectrum to do the same. Much as Bill Buckley did in the conservative movement in the 1960s, when he expelled the Birchers and the Ku Klux Klan and other extremists. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that, you know, person or persons arising, you know, on the center right. I hope we see them soon.
Could I add, just because it's such a rich question and discussion, I would add one thing. I love, Eric, your points are really profound, taking notes here. But I think in addition to you're no better than us, it does go somewhere else, right? It goes, if you take that democratic model, if you go the American way, you're going to get chaos. Look at the Arab Spring. You know, even you who are complaining about what's happening to the Rohingya, that's democratization for you, right? So they're going a little further, that they're absolutely trying to create a kind of moral equivalence, but there's a kind of consequentialism that they're introducing, which is Look at the long lines, look at people, taking tents to go and vote in America. Like, look how chaotic it is. Look at the COVID death rate and the infection rate in America, competence.
Look at our great high-speed trains.
Yeah, look at our great high-speed trains. So I would just note, I think Kori started us there, but just the relationship between confidence and competence. And a democracy that is pluralistic and flourishing and 1,000 flowers are blooming, that doesn't descend into chaos. Look at the advantage they have taken of George Floyd, not only because it symbolizes that we're all the same. You have human rights abuses, we have human rights issues, or whatever, you complain about human rights, but also just protests, the streets, Trump's clearing of the square. So there's an equivalence, but there's this other kind of dimension to it, I think. And then I would just note, to your point about how threatened they are by these norms and these rules, I note two things. First, just how hard the Chinese are working now in the international system. So if I look at the trajectory, let's say, since China joined the UN in the 70s, or took up the seat in the 70s, initially it was very, very narrow. We are going to protect our reputation, our brand. You come after us, then we'll pull out, the big guns, and they had the G77 behind them. Then, kind of in the last decade, maybe even a little bit further back than that, they're starting to be more aggressive as it relates to insulating other authoritarian governments from criticism or from being held accountable to the international, let's say, human rights norms or international humanitarian law. So, and mainly in the near abroad, but going further afield, especially like toward the tail end of my time, the Obama administration into the Trump administration, suddenly, being willing to exert almost as much political capital to protect the South Sudanese government as the Myanmar government, right? Not quite as much, to be clear, but nonetheless, like really kind of moving in that direction. But the direction they've moved in and had started doing, again, before the Trump administration, but now they've had a little more open season to do it, is after the shift from we'll protect ourselves to we'll protect others, because by protecting others, we'll weaken the system's overall ability to scrutinize what happens in our country, but also we'll look out for fellow sovereigns and try to diminish the power of these human rights norms. Now it's like, let's change the norms altogether. Let's just get rid of the standards in the first place. That'll make our lives much easier. Not only we will not have to work as hard to protect ourselves, but we don't have to do all this extra work, to protect those countries to which we're now exporting these technologies and so forth. That's a really significant shift. And the report gets at it, especially in the tech space and the information space in terms of the UN standard setting bodies and so forth. But it's an ambitious agenda. It's that the standards themselves are watered down because of concerns about regime legitimacy. For as long as those rules are out there, and of course the survivalist instinct is number one, as the report makes clear, but as long as those rules are out there, those rules are a threat. And those rules, of course, being reflective of the rules that we need to ensure are respected and promoted and protected here at home, because it's, they just live in, if nobody's enforcing them, democracies, if democracies aren't the best flag bearers for those rules, they're just hanging in the wind anyway. But I just think it speaks to this vulnerability. They now have specialized teams deployed to New York that I never saw in my time, and I just left in January 2017. Fighting in all of these little crannies of the UN system, because to this question of ideology, these liberal principles that have been embedded, maybe the international order, as was said about the Holy Roman Empire, was never liberal, never international, never an order, like whatever we can stipulate, but there's enough in the system that embeds the practices and the laws and the standards of democracies that they want to change that. And then the very last thing I'd say, just because it comes from the report, and we should always quote the report in panels like this where we can, but I love this as just shorthand for how this ideological struggle can get framed from page 11. The political struggle between democracies and authoritarians ultimately hinges on the question of whether governments will respond to or repress their people. That's a pretty good, and so the fact that we're all kind of scurrying around lacking confidence and will we win this ideological battle? I mean, they're really, in the old saying of being, the worst system compared to all the others, this brittleness that Kori speaks to so often, the way we know our own dysfunction so much better than we know theirs, because we're in our dysfunction, we're in our polarization, we're in our, Trump land, and we're in our concern, Eric, to your point about whether the center right will hold and whether they will speak out. We're well aware of our flaws, but there is a way in which we see this bright, shiny object and don't see, and in a way, how hard they're working at the UN and everywhere else is just a reflection of just how brittle I think they are aware that system is.
Thanks, that was really rich. Stephen Erlinger from the New York Times asks about our authoritarian allies, like Turkey, Poland, Hungary, and our corrupt allies in Malta and Bulgaria. And his question is, do we simply preach to them, or is there direct action that we need to take? And I suspect, Eric, you might have some thoughts on this.
Well, I think, first of all, we've got to put human rights, democracy promotion, and support for the rule of law back, at the center of our foreign policy and national security policy. Does that make for a number of tricky relationships? Yes. Does it make life much harder for diplomats because they have to walk and chew gum at the same time? Well, yeah. But we've shown historically that, we're able to do this. We've been able to midwife, democratic outcomes in, allies that were, problematic or imperfect democracies, as Dean Acheson said at the time of the Truman Doctrine speech and the Greek-Turkish aid bill. I mean, both Greece and Turkey were regarded at the time by Acheson as imperfect democracies. And when I was ambassador to Turkey, much of my, preaching to the country team was that, part of our job as a good ally to Turkey is to try to help them become a more perfect democracy over time. Are they ever going to be perfect? No, neither are we. But, we can help push them along. And in my time, and part of that was the EU accession agenda and trying to get them to meet, basic EU standards. When I was there, Tayyip Erdogan used to say that the EU Copenhagen criteria shouldn't, be called the Copenhagen criteria. They should be the Ankara criteria, because we ought to want to do those things just for what they will do for Turkey. And he was right. And it's a shame that he's abandoned, that approach. And the U.S. government, in my view, ought to do all it can to try and get him and other wayward allies back to that, kind of approach, to do the things we want them to do, not because we tell them to do them, but it's because it's going to help make their citizens, freer, more prosperous, and happier.
And just to add that our strength in having those conversations and in seeking to exert leverage, to state the obvious, is far greater when we have other countries by our side, other democracies by our side. And again, there's plenty to point to in terms of the Trump administration's, it's pretty isolated here or there, let's say on Venezuela, or, belatedly on China, being outspoken on Hong Kong by the time, the ship had already sailed, unfortunately, but it's almost never done with fellow democracies by our side. And that's, I don't want to underestimate the degree of difficulty. I mean, given how countries, in seeing the Chinese market, in having some predispositions that many in the US government have as well, to be kind of more reticent on this set of issues, and to have other economic and security issues, and of course the democracy and human rights issues are very linked to the economic and security, but nonetheless the sort of short-term imperatives can lead actors within our own government, but also countries, of course, that we're allied with, to want to kind of duck these issues. But that's one of the reasons this Democracy Summit and the ideas behind it are so important, is to recognize, you take the US, the EU, and Canada, you got 2.5 times the GDP of China, right? That's a different kind of leverage to bring to bear as you're seeking to exert influence, whether with allies like Turkey and Egypt, with whom we have security cooperation, or in sub-Saharan Africa and places where you have so many countries that are on the fence. We're heading in a democratic direction, now backsliding, like Tanzania, or democracies that are just longing to be reached out to, who feel a little bit isolated now in that part of the world. So just not to forget the power in numbers that used to be core to thinking about U.S. leadership, but of course has receded of late.
I think that's a good place for us to end, thinking about what democracies can do together, because of course this is one of the key strategic advantages that democracies have in this competition. So thank you, all of you, for your time on the task force, your incredibly valuable inputs, and for your incredibly valuable inputs to the discussion today. And thanks to all of you at home who submitted many more questions than we could get to. I think it was a sign of just how engaging this conversation was. So thank you again, and we hope to see you soon. Bye now.